Top 10 teachings on the Gemara Brachot, Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Very quickly an overview. The Talmud is talking about things that would be wrong about going into a desolate building, and it names three things that would be an issue. One is the issue of arousing suspicion, and particularly we're afraid that people might think that you're going there to do something with a woman of ill repute in the room. The other thing is that there's a danger of the building falling. It's probably not up to code. And the third thing is that we're concerned about demons. So that leads us to the first top teachings of the page, which is what's wrong with doing something that looks suspicious. In other words, if you know that you're not doing anything wrong, like the story on Gimel Amud Aleph, where the rabbi decided that he was going to go and pray in a room, and he obviously wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to avoid the distractions of the street. Rabbi Yossi, he goes into a room to pray. Why would we say about somebody who's just doing a good thing in a room that you shouldn't go in there because it looks suspicious? In general, we are very suspicious people. Not so much of others, where the most, I think, Jews are. There have been studies that shown that their toleration and their assessment of others outside of the Jewish community are on a much higher level than any other group. How they look at others. That's why Jews are always wanting to believe that other people are okay with them, and we've got so many Jews who can't seem to believe that there are actually people who want to kill us and hate us, because it just doesn't seem real to them. But we are very suspicious when it comes to one another, and there's a lot of shame in the society, specifically in a very religious society, a very tight-knit family society. And the Talmud was talking in that period that continues to be effective today, even in many very religious circles, where everybody's looking at you. They're looking at you because soon your kids are going to be in the Parsha, which means they're getting up to the time of Shidduchim. So whether it's a law on Shabbos, for example, there's many laws on Shabbos that we forbid certain things that are technically permissible, but it looks like it's not okay. So, for example, there could be a sharecropper who's working on a field that you own, and they're working for themselves because they get, let's say, 50% of the produce. But since it's property and people know it's your property, they don't know the arrangement. They're going to assume that you ordered them to go to work on a Saturday, on a Shabbat. And because of that assumption, of that suspicion, you're forbidden to do that. And that's one of many, probably about 100. I mean, I don't really know a number. I'm just making up, let's say about 100 laws in the Talmud that would fall into some categorization of either something called marat ayin, which means how people see something, or chshad, which means suspicion. There's sometimes slight differences. Sometimes marat ayin is not just simply people suspecting you of something as much as them giving you kind of an evil eye because they think you have more than you actually do have. But generally, usually the marat ayin is referring to some type of halachic suspicion that is not allowed, not because it's essentially wrong, but because it looks wrong, or people might misunderstand it. So the question is, why? I mean, what do you care what people might think? You know what you're doing is right. Why do we need to be concerned? Why is the Talmud concerned? The Meir Shilach offers the following insight. First of all, he asks a question. Why is it that we sometimes don't do something that's wrong, not because God said it, not because the Torah forbids it, but rather because we are nervous that our neighbors or our friends are going to catch us and out us and talk about it. And that's the reason. And he says, if anything, that motivation is not holy at all. It's just, it's not about being God-fearing. It's just fearing your own reputation being harmed. And he says, yet, although it isn't a holy motivation, it's still better than the alternative. And this fits into a teaching in Hasidus in general, starting from the Baal Shem Tov, really also based on Kabbalah and the Talmud, which is we're not always looking for perfection because human beings are inherently flawed, but rather we're looking for movement in the right direction. So if stopping yourself from doing something because you're afraid that somebody else might catch you and humiliate you and embarrass you, while you're not a very spiritual person, you're still not a sinner. And that's okay for the time being. You might set your goals higher, but don't stop yourself from stopping yourself from sinning because you're not doing it for the right reason. Don't worry about it. Just stop yourself, even if it's not the highest reason. With that, we can now come back to understanding why it's important not to do things that arouse suspicion in other people. And the reason is as follows. If you do things, and you get accustomed to doing things that other people start whispering about, and you just don't give a whatever, right? Starts with a D. And you say, I know what I'm doing is right, I don't care what other people think, then you will have a nature of a very brave person, but that braveness can also mean that you just don't care about other people, right or wrong. And then at some point, we're afraid that you actually will do the wrong thing. You won't care what other people think because you've trained yourself not to care. So that's an insight. It's kind of based on the Mei Shilach. Don't get upset at me if you look at the Mei Shilach and you don't see it exactly in there. You may not see it like that, but that's kind of something I felt. I got inspired. Like Shlomo Carlebach used to say, when he reads a sefer, when he reads a book, even if he has an idea that comes to him that's the exact opposite of the book that he's reading, he'll quote the book because the idea came to him when he was reading the book. So that idea is, again, based on the Mei Shilach. So that's the concept of suspicious activity. Okay, let's continue with number 2 of the top 10 teachings on Brachot, which is this idea of entering into the rune psychologically. What that means is a rune represents a desolate place where you don't have like an establishment of the way things are. Now, it might be okay. You might be able to meditate there. You find your quiet corner. You could create your own new reality. A lot of people actually are looking for exactly that. They're sick of people. They can't stand their families. They just want to go find a quiet place, a secluded place, even if it's not built up. Because once it's built up, it's people again. And they want to do it on their own. The problem with that, and this is from Tzidkas HaTzadik, Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, who I've been quoting a lot lately, the 19th century Hasidic rabbi who is one of the main disciples of the Mei Shilach, the Ishbitzer Rebbi, who talks a lot about Kabbalah and psychology, but really outstanding Talmudic scholar. One of the few that is almost fully embraced by the non-Hasidic world as well as the Hasidic world. He says the following: a lot of times we're not really sure about where our heart is, if our heart is in the right place when we try to break away and make our own path or seclude ourselves or not be part of the kahal, not be part of the community. Maimonides, for example, says it's very important to be part of a community, but however, if it's a community of sinners, he says go live in the desert, meaning if your only alternative to obtain holiness is by secluding yourself, then seclude yourself. Reb Tzadok says, on the other hand, it's all about knowing your intentions. And when you're kind of going out alone, so to speak, the desolate place represents going on your own path. He says there's always a danger that you could be misled by your own ego, by your own either sense of self-aggrandizement, and sometimes a Jew wants to be unique, but in their uniqueness, it's just all about them. It's all about, it's not about God. It's not about truth. It's another way to just like say, look at me, no matter what the cost is. So that could be one of the problems, is a question of motivation. And that's a key thing in all of the Hasidic teachings of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. And I think it's a great way to study Talmud, which is a kind of a psychological self-analysis of what's really going on inside you when you want to do something. Is it really for the good, or is it just, are you selling yourself a story? The person we lie to the most all the time is ourselves. Then it's easier to lie to society. So that is the psychological issue. And he suggests that perhaps it's when you go with a friend, meaning at least don't do it alone. At least have one person with you to know that you're motivated not just for selfish reasons. That's number two. Number three is there's a debate in the Talmud. What is the debate? The debate is Tana Rabbanan. The rabbis taught in Tosefta. You could look at it in the back of certain editions. Have the Tosefta. The Tosefta is a part of the literature of the rabbis at the same time as the Mishnaic period. It means addition, not to be confused with Tosafot, which is a 12th, 13th century work. The Tosefta is more like a 2nd, 3rd century work. I don't know when it was actually committed to writing, but it was a parallel to the time of the Mishnah. So there it says, there's a debate if Arba Mishmarat Haba Halayla Divrei Rebbi. Rebbi, who is the editor of the Mishnah, also a descendant of King David, says there are 4 watches in the night. You can divide a night. We're going to talk about a 12-hour night, like a summer night. So it's got 4 watches. Each of those things would be 3 hours. 3 hours each. Rabbi Nassan Omer Shalosh. Rabbi Nassan argues on Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and says there's only 3 watches, which would mean they'd each be 4 hours. And my time at Rabbi Nassan, what's the reason that Rabbi Nassan gives? And he brings a proof text from a verse that seems to indicate that there are three watches. So let's talk a little bit about what they're arguing about. Well, they're arguing about how to interpret different verses in the Torah. And anybody who wants to take a look at that, I'm not going to really read that. I might do it later if I have time, but I'm not going to stop right now to do it. But they both have different proof texts, but they're also arguing about something more than just that. One of the commentators, I wrote it in my notes. I'm going to look to see who it was. It's brought down in a sefer called the Marat Ha'ayin, and he brings it down in the name of Iyun Yaakov. So he says the debate can be said to be really about who are we giving more prominence to? Who's a bigger influence on us? Is it 3 or 4? The 3 are the 3 Avot, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the 4 would be the 4 Imot, the 4 mothers, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Now, that's an interesting argument because, that's a long time ago. And what does it have to do with how we divide the night today? And interestingly enough, one of the other elements that's interesting is that you have 3 avot and 4 imaot. You have an extra mom, but for example, if you're driving a car, or a chariot for that matter, you want to have a car with 4 wheels, not 3 wheels. I mean, they have vehicles with 3 wheels, but it's safer. It's less likely to turn over with 4 wheels. You could even have 1 or 2 wheels, but 4 wheels, 4-wheel drive, go up into the mountains. What about, what is that? What does it represent of the 4 mothers versus the 3 fathers? So there's a lot of Kabbalistic talk about that. We're not gonna do that right now, but the fathers and the mothers represent, in a general sense, the people that preceded us and the archetypes that become kind of embedded in what Am Yisrael is, what the people of Israel have in them, the qualities that they have in them, and the struggles that they have in them. So the 3 and the 4, being the fathers and the mothers, are a little bit of a shout out to those powers, those abilities that both the Avot and the Imaot, both the fathers and the mothers, imbued in us. And that is number 3. Number 4 is, I mentioned before that Rebbi Yehoshua Nasi, is a descendant of King David. It happens to be Hanukkah today, so let me just diverge from Brachot and talk a little bit about Hanukkah for a moment. Those who study the Mishnah know that there is no Masechta, there is no tractate on Hanukkah. It's mentioned in a kind of off-the-cuff way almost in Tractate Baba Kama, which deals with a tort law, and it's talking about a camel whose pack straw gets lit up by a menorah, by a candelabra outside a shopkeeper's store, and on Hanukkah, the shopkeeper is not liable for that because he had permission to put the menorah by the door of his store by the street. So we see from that Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, clearly knew about Hanukkah. He mentions it with halachic ramifications in other legal elements, not so much ritualistic, but more nizikin, they're called, like monetary, in this case tort law, damages. One party's injured by another party's property, in this case the menorah, the fire of the menorah. Now, why doesn't he make a tractate of it? Why doesn't he make a chapter of it, let's say, in Shabbos somehow? The Talmud deals with it relatively extensively. It's got about 3-4 pages on it in Masechta Shabbos on 21. The discussion about Shabbos candles leads into Hanukkah candles and then tells the story of Hanukkah. And it's a really amazing. If I wasn't doing the Brachot, I'd be doing a big segment on that right today. And if I end up having time, maybe I will, but I don't know if I have any time. But let's get back to what this has to do with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So why didn't he include Hanukkah in the Talmud? Some people come up with the explanation that there was a rivalry between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who descended, he was a Nasi, he was a prince, and he descended from the house of King David, and there was a rivalry between him and or his household, so to speak, and the Chashmonaim, the priestly class that had become kings in the Second Temple period, starting from the story of Hanukkah. So it's almost as if he would have kind of left them out because of a family rivalry, which is very interesting. That might explain why here, another alternative explanation that's brought down of the debate between 3 and 4, that Rebbi says it's 4 and Rabbi Nassan says it's 3, is that Rebbi, the fourth one would be King David, because a lot of people say that there's this concept of the 4-legged chair, or as I said, the 4-wheeled wagon or car, vehicle, and the 4th wheel is King David. So Rebbi, his anacle, his descendant, is defending him, and the other party, Rabbi Nassan, might be challenging, including him, because after all, there's these terrible stories that King David was involved in, instigated, and so on and so forth. So taking that concept a little further, perhaps Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't want to put in the heroes of Hanukkah who were antagonistic. They usurped the role of kingship, and even the rabbis, not just Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, did condemn them, not originally in the story of Hanukkah, of course, they were heroes, but later on, when they refused to give back the power, the reign of as kings to the house of King David, they were criticized by the rabbis. A lot of people, including the Lubavitcher Rebbi, do not like that answer that other people give. They claim that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi cannot have a vendetta. If the halacha is the halacha, if the law is the law, you got to include it in the Mishnah. He can't just leave it out because he doesn't like that family. And especially since they were holy people, especially in the time of the story of Hanukkah, even if they later lost that sanctity. So there are alternative answers, and one of them might be is that the Talmud is primarily preoccupied with creating a link between biblical law and rabbinic law. And it doesn't really want to take something which is purely rabbinic and make a tractate out of it. There are exceptions. For example, the third tractate of the Talmud is Masechtas Eruvin. Many of the laws of Eruvin are not biblical. The biblical parts of them could have been included in Shabbat, and therefore the question is, that doesn't fit my thesis, since you do have a tractate that's primarily preoccupied with rabbinic law. Well, the answer would be is that it's part of the laws of Shabbat, and Shabbat is a biblical law. So even the rabbinic add-ons it's okay to have a tractate on rabbinic things that are dealing with a biblical law, in addition to biblical law. Hanukkah, on the other hand, is purely a rabbinic enactment. Even the menorah, which is now called the Chanukiah, is specifically 8 with the shamash and not 7. Particularly, it can't be like the 7 of the menorah of the temple. And therefore, even though it reminds us of a miracle that happened in the temple, it is not really sourced in the Bible. And Megillah, on the other hand, even though it is a later day part of Ketuvim, called one of the 5 Megillot, the Megillat Esther, the story of Esther and the celebration of Purim, which is a tractate called Tractate Megillah, that has, again, a whole Megillah, a whole part of a written writing, and therefore it is included. But anyway, that's a little break that's somehow connected vaguely to our page of Talmud through Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his descent, being a descendant of King David, and how that may or may not have had an effect of why Hanukkah was not included as a tractate in the Mishnayos. Okay, let's continue with number 5. The Talmud goes on, and I'll go back into it to show you what I'm talking about. The Talmud goes on into a detailed analysis of the two opinions of Rebbi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabbi Nassan, the 3 versus the 4 segments of the night. At some point, there's a question that's raised, and in order to answer the question, because it has to do with King David waking up at midnight, but also saying that Kadmuni Eni Ashmorot, which means I wake up 2 watches before, So the question is, how is that possible? HaKetzad, Arba Mishmaros Hava Alayla. That would only be possible if there is 4 watches. In other words, you could wake up at midnight and still have 2 more watches for the next of 3 hours each, and wake up at before 6 a.m. But Rabbi Nassan, who says that there's only 3 watches, he has a problem, because midnight is you only have a watch and a half left. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Nassan suffered like Rabbi Yehoshua. He holds like a sage named Rabbi Yehoshua. Now we're gonna. It will be confusing for a moment, but just bear with me. I'll explain it all. Ditznan Rabbi Yehoshua Omer al shalosh ad shalosh saos, that a person is able to read the morning Shema for the first 3 hours of the day. He gives a rationale, because the way of the kings is to wake up on the 3rd hour. So then, let's do this new math. So when King David is saying, I wake up at midnight, and then another verse is saying, but I wake up 2 watches before everyone else, he doesn't literally mean everyone else. He means everyone in his pay range, meaning other kings. That would mean Shista Leila V'tarti Di'mama, 6 night hours, which is still night, and the first 2 hours of the day makes 8. So Havalahu Shtei Mishmaros, that's 2 times 4, 8 hours, that's 2 watches. Okay, here's the question I had that bothered me, which is, without getting into all the details, Rabbi Yehoshua says you have 3 hours in the morning to recite the Shema, because it has to be uvkumecha. When you get up, it doesn't have to be when a person who has to run early in the morning gets up. It could be when a king gets up. So you have the first 3 hours of the day. But the problem is, our Gemara says, King David said, I've got 2 hours of the day. I've got a 6 hour of the night and additional 2 hour of the day head start on my, fellow kings of the world. It's not 2, it's 3. The math doesn't add up. The Pnei Yehoshua asked this question, and he answers in the following way: that Rabbi Yehoshua acknowledges that the kings get up for the 3rd hour. The beginning of the 3rd hour comes right after the end of the 2nd hour. The end of the 3rd hour is the end of the 3rd hour. So we give people a chance to recite the whole Shema for all 3 first hours of the day. But King David, who's kind of, saying how great it is that he wakes up so early, that he wakes up 8 hours before the other kings, is not going to overly brag and say 9 hours just because there's, they wake up during the course of an hour of the 3rd hour. So he's not going to brag by talking about when some of them have already woken up, which is the beginning of the 3rd hour. So he'll just use 2 of those 3 hours, and that reconciles the seemingly hour that's missing from this Talmud. And that's how the Pnei Yehoshua, a rabbi who lived nearly 300 years ago, a fascinating figure and a great scholar, explains Rabbi Yehoshua of the time period of the Mishnah. Okay, number 6. The Gemara continues, and once it's kind of telling us interesting things by different rabbis, it continues to tell us some kind of way out things. So one of the things it tells us is that Ein omer b'fnei hames ela dvarav shel mes, that when you're standing by a deceased person, a dead person, don't talk about stuff, only about if it's regarding that person, like arranging his funeral. And Rabbi Abba Bar Kana says, we only say that ela b'divrei Torah if you're talking Torah. Alva mili de alma, but if you're just talking about regular worldly things, less on, but that's okay. Vika de ami, others quote the same rabbi and say, lo arman ela afilu b'divrei Torah. We say even Torah, v'koshke mil dalma, and for certainly other things you shouldn't talk in front of the body. So the question is, why not? So because basically you're making the dead person, if it's just, let's say, Torah, and you're talking Torah in front of the dead person, you're making them feel bad because you can study Torah and they can no longer study Torah. But if you're not even allowed to talk about anything in front of them, what's that about? So the commentaries actually say, there is an opinion that says, it's brought down, the Ritva brings it down, that a dead person, until he's buried, he or she is buried, actually hears what you say, and you cause them anguish. And the Torah tells us, Vasisa hayashav ha'tov, do the right thing. So you're hurting a dead person. So the question is, do we really believe that a dead person actually hears you? And what does that mean? So to answer that question, I'm going to share with you a thought that the Zohar says. Sometimes I think the Zohar is actually in part a commentary, not mostly on the Torah, sometimes on the Medrash, and sometimes it really fits in with a Talmudic saying such as this. And that's one of my things that I like to kind of explain to people, that the Zohar and the Talmud, a lot of scholars kind of scoff at the idea of how connected they might be, and like really, again, learn them totally separately. But it's really disingenuous. The more you really study Kabbalah, and the more you really study the Talmud, to really say that the Talmud had a mystical belief system, but it was definitely not coherent, for the lack of a better word, and that the Kabbalah is tuned in to certain things in the Talmud and the Medrash, and whether they're just mirroring them or expanding and saying something, sometimes the opposite, but they're aware of certain things. So this is an example of that. Now let me talk about the Zohar for a moment. The Zohar, in the context of explaining ritual practice after the time of death, and the Talmud, the outline of this kind of the mourning rituals in the Talmud are elaborated in a tractate called Moed Katan, and it's a fascinating, it's a beautiful tractate, and it really informs us so much about the respect we give to the deceased and to their family. In that time period, what's interesting is that your certain mitzvot that you're not even supposed to do, for example, tefillin or brachot or prayers, you're not supposed to do them in that time period, because you're not even properly mourning. You're in a grief. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says that you don't comfort somebody when the corpse is still there. You haven't even buried them. So first you got to get to the burial, and then the shiva begins. But just because it's not yet the shiva, there's still certain laws of mourning are in place. A lot of people don't know that. It's like you don't go to the movies, between the death of a close relative that you're going to sit shiva for and the burial. And there are many laws. But here's the catch. Here's what the Zohar says. The Zohar says that the reason that you can't comfort the deceased in that period is because the deceased, there's a Freudian slip there. The reason why you can't comfort the mourners is because the deceased is uncomforted at that moment of death until the burial, because the soul of the body is so intertwined with being and living in the body. Take off. It doesn't go to heaven. It just kind of hangs around and looks down at its body and says, "Whoa, what is going on?" It's not able to separate and start finding its place up in heaven. It's not yet the time to comfort the mourners who are in an agitated state because the soul of their loved one is also agitated. With that, we can understand what it means, what the Ritva says here. The Ritva is a great halachic authority. I mean, he's one of the prime students of the Rashba, was a prime student of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who is one of the greatest of all the Rishonim, of all of the medieval commentators. So the Ritva statement that says that the dead people, and it's not really just the Ritva, it's really based on other sections of the Talmud. The Ritva is basically just tune into them. That would fit in very well with the Zohar, that the soul of the person doesn't just go up into heaven in the beginning. And the Zohar goes further with that and explains where the soul is during the Shiva, that it's still not really in heaven. It's still between the burial place and the place where the Shiva is being sat, presumably best sat in the home where the deceased lived, because it's still like kind of getting ready to make the stages of dying and stages of death. Death isn't just like the person's dead, gone somewhere else, no longer here. They're actually stages. So this fits in with the Ritva. This fits in with the way we're interpreting this Gemara. However, we're going to now take that to number 7, which is tucking in your tzitis at the cemetery. everybody knows that, not everybody knows, but a lot of us know that you've got the tzitis, right? You've got the religious Jewish men, nowadays some of the women even, like to wear tzitis, supposed to wear tzitzis. So that's the custom. Is it really you're required to put tzitzis on any four-cornered garment? If you don't have a four-cornered garment, you're not obligated to get one, but the custom has become increasingly to wear tzitzis. Let's say you go to a funeral and you've got your tzitzis out because a lot of Jews like to wear their tzitzis. There's some Hasidim who wear not just the strands out, but the very garment itself. They wear it outside, so it's like super Jews. Everybody could see them from a million miles away that they're Jewish. There's no questioning that. So the question is that okay in the cemetery? So it's brought down in the Rush. Let me see who brings it down. Let me look at my notes again. I believe it's brought down in the Rif and the Rush that that the law is that you can't talk about the deceased, or actually you can't learn Torah in front of the deceased. And furthermore, other people say you can't do any mitzvot, specifically tefillin or talis in the cemetery, or learn Torah when you're within 4 amot, 6-8 feet from a grave site. So what we do is we do have a talit katan. It's called the tzitzis is called the talit katan, a smaller talit. We do wear. We don't take it off before we go to the cemetery, but our custom is to tuck them in, so to speak, the deceased shouldn't see it. Now, this is a little bit more problematic. We just said the Ritva says once they're buried, they're not paying attention anymore. But the truth is that at a certain point, it's not just about them actually hearing it as much as the concept, the disregard for their honor. They can no longer do mitzvot, so we shouldn't flaunt mitzvot in their presence. So that is number 7. Number 8 is King David's Harp at Midnight, which I see my friend Kurt Feinberg, Morty Feinberg, good to see you. You wrote, let's see, amazing how tzaddikim know what time it is even without a watch. David HaMelech knew it was midnight, also like the story of the Alter Rebbi in prison with his captors tried to fool him about the time, certain colors at certain times, as is known. So what my friend Kurt is referring to is there's this idea that nowadays everybody's got a smartphone with a time on it, or a watch, or a smart watch. But for most of history, they told time. They had sundials and they had other ways of telling time, but it wasn't nearly as easy. They mostly were aware of where the sun is setting, or where it is in the sky, or how dark it is, or when dawn is coming, which is so interesting. Why this beginning of this tractate is really all about that. But King David, it said, he would wake up at midnight, and the Talmud really discusses in great detail the fact that there seems to be contradictory verses that seem to say that he would wake up earlier in the night, and it resolves it by saying he'd wake up earlier and then kind of doze on and off till midnight, or he'd wake up earlier and study Torah, and then at midnight he'd compose the Psalms. He'd do shiros v'sishbachot. He'd praise God. So how would he wake up? It said he would have a kinar, which is a harp or a lyre, and the window would be open, and at midnight a northern wind, tzafonit, ruach tzafonit. The Rashi brings down this concept that there are 4 directions, right? North, south, east, and west, and that there are 4 time periods. Day, night, midnight, and midday. And each period, another wind from another one of these directions blows, or how do you say wind blows? I guess that's how you say it. But a lot of the commentaries explain that to really understand this Talmud, and any of the Talmud, and any of kind of the ancient teachings about directions, we have to understand that each direction represented a certain force in the universe. So, so when we talk about the four winds and the four directions and the 4 times a day, that's very critical to understanding kind of the transition from day to night, which at midnight, even though it's not dawn yet, but the harshest hours have passed, and we're now transitioning to the second half of night that will begin eventually to have dawn and daybreak. So this concept is this awareness of change in the universe, where there's no perception of it on a regular way, but you have to be in tune. Perhaps there are forces in nature that the Talmud identified on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, like the dogs barking. Right, the dogs could be barking at midnight, according to one opinion. And again, this is connected as very much to the practice of the Kabbalists to do Tikkun Chatzot, to do the midnight mourning of the destruction of the temple. It's not just mourning of the temple. That's a misunderstanding of it. It's really about unifying the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Shekhinah, which is really the key component of what the Zohar thinks is what our goals should be in life. Okay, now we're going to continue to number 9, which is a discussion in the Talmud about midnight, because it says that King David would get up at midnight. He knew what midnight is, but the problem is that when Moses tells Pharaoh that around midnight God is going to strike down the firstborn, the problem is that would seem to indicate that God can't identify the precise moment of midnight, and he has to kind of say it in a more vague way, around midnight. And the Talmud is going to discuss this. It kind of goes down and leaks over onto Dalet Amud Aleph, so that I'm going to deal with in another class, to the conclusion of that discussion. But the Talmud makes a statement that says, is there a doubt in God's eyes? And obviously not. It's a rhetorical question. There is God knows when it's midnight. He doesn't. The eventual answer is, it's not that God doesn't know. God knows. Even Moses knows. If David knows, Moses definitely knows. Moses has a higher level of prophecy than David. But what it means is that he didn't want to give the astrologers and sorcerers of Egypt a way to misinterpret and claim that, no, it wasn't exactly midnight, even though it would have been, but they would have had the wrong clocks, the wrong timepieces, and then they would have claimed that, oh, Moses lied. So this concept of, is there no doubt in God's eyes, as a rhetorical question, is very interesting, because one of the basic premises of Kabbalah, specifically Lurianic Kabbalah, is that idea that God creates doubt in this paradoxical way where he removes himself, at least his acknowledgeable presence, which is called his or, his light, by creating a vacuum of his light, a empty space. Metaphorically, it's not an actual physical space where his light isn't, and it's not physical light. But it's only because of that kind of creation of doubt that human beings can come to God on their own without it being kind of programmed into them, and they could choose to become spiritual and holy and just and good and so on and so forth. So that's something that we say that it's kind of like a one-way mirror where God sees the whole truth. And in Chassidut, the beauty of it is that it's called Das Elyon and Das Tachton. Even in spiritual practice, the lower level practice means Das Tachton, like God is very real, but so am I. And from my perspective, I can't really see things the way God sees things. But Das Elyon is an expanded consciousness. And I think one of the purposes of having that Das Elyon is to get out of yourself and be able to transcend your own worries and anxieties to see the way through the whole. And that's the godly vision. So that's what a lesson we can learn from that. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Have a great day. Okay, I just did a top 10 teachings on Brachot, Daf Gimel Amud Beis, and I forgot the 10th one. The 10th one is like the fun one, which is Bernie Sanders' economic plan. Tosfos thinks it will fail. What's the story there? What am I talking about? Well, there's a Tosfos at the here it is, and it's talking about King David and his advisors. They're talking about the economic growth or stagnation of the people of Israel in ancient Israel in the time of King David. And here is a point of how the Tosafot and the commentators are trying to kind of understand this. King David says, let everyone do business. And his advisors say, that's not enough. It's like, they say something which is kind of vague, no, but it's not clear what it is. It's something like, you can't fill up a hole with its dirt, or a pit with its water. And the rabbis are trying to figure out what it means. And here's the commentary in the Tosafot, V'ri Pirish, Shimtach for mitzad zeh v'tanich mitzad acher lo timaleh. If you dig from one side and fill in from another side, it's not going to be filled. Shema shenosin kan chasar kan. What you dig up to put somewhere else is then going to be missing where you dug it from. Kemokein ma shenoto min ha'ashirim yischasa min ha'ashirim. If your economic plan is to tax the wealthy to sustain the poor, now the wealthy will be missing. So what this in effect is saying is Bernie Sanders has this economic plan, which is, and Elizabeth Warren as well, they're pretty similar, which is, we hate billionaires. Billionaires are responsible for all of our problems. Let's just tax them to, maybe not to death, and what they're not really telling you, because like when Elizabeth Warren attacked Pete Buttigieg about that wine cave and said it was, all these billionaires, it wasn't billionaires, it was millionaires, is that they're going to tax billionaires and millionaires and probably people who just, make a decent living. But here's the problem with that, according to Tosafot. Certain people, like I live in New York City, I'd say like I struggle financially, but I make a lot of money compared to when I lived in Florida. But New York City is a very expensive city to live in Manhattan, So if you were going to be like, tax me even more, I wouldn't survive. I wouldn't be able to do it. So the real issue that Tosfos points out here is that you can't just say tax the rich, because then you think you're fixing economic disparity, but you're creating a new problem. There's a lot of upper middle class people who are just surviving, and if you're going to just kind of like, you claim it's after the billionaires, but we all know that that's just not really going to be what happens. And but then again, robots are going to take over at some point, doing more and more work as they get smarter and smarter. So we'll revisit Bernie then when that happens. Thank you.